Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I always enjoy a hot breakfast, and it was a very nice breakfast. You're talking about my years as Deputy PM. I stepped down in the middle of 05, July 05, which is quite a while ago now, and I remember saying to Julia, I could take a few days off. She actually wasn't very impressed with this idea because she thought I'd had too many days off as it was. And go with our son Nicholas, because he'd secured himself a spot on exchange to a school in Scotland. So he was only about 15 or 16, and it was agreed that I should take him over and that we'd show him where Julia's family came from in the Lochrannoch region of Scotland and where my family came from in Oban. And the point of the story was we ended up in Oban in a little bed and breakfast with quite a few rooms, a few more rooms than most of those places have. We went down to breakfast the next morning, crowded little dining room with quite a few little tables in it, and a couple from, as it turned out, Melbourne walked in. An older couple, retired, and I'd only been out of the Deputy Prime Ministership for literally 7 or 8 days. They hadn't heard the news. They walk in, and his jaw drops. He says to his wife, "What on earth do you think John Anderson's doing here in Scotland?" And I wasn't meant to hear this. But our hostess was a little Scottish lady about yay high, and much the same across, very stout and very dour. And he said to her, "How do you come to have the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia in your dining room?" She showed no interest whatsoever, none. He repeated it. He said, "That fellow over there with the boy, probably his son, that's the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. How does he come to be in your dining room?" No interest. "Madam, that fellow over there is the Deputy Prime Minister of my country. Why are you hosting him here? What's he doing here?" She looked at him and said, "You want your eggs poached or scrambled?" So you quickly learn your place, as Peter Costello knows. It's been great being out here with Peter. I often say that one of the enormous, perhaps the greatest privilege of all, of having served for 19 years in the Parliament, was to have served closely with Peter and with John Howard. An extraordinary privilege, remarkable men, and I like to believe they headed up a government that was trusted because it was trustworthy, including in terms of its competency. And I wanted to talk a bit about freedom and its handmaiden, which is trust, this morning. But before I do, I'd just like to say, Gaelle, with Dale here, your husband today, I came here today because you're a person who can be trusted. And if I think there's one thing Australians are looking for now in their leaders, it's people who can be trusted. And if we continue to erode trust, we will continue to erode our freedom. And so it is that I'm not here to talk about small business policy or agricultural policy. I couldn't anyway because I'm out of it, or economic policy because Peter Costello would tell me I should go back to cows when I talk about economic policy, even though I served with him all those years on the RC and what have you. I wanted to talk at a slightly higher level. Let's just try and take a bit of a helicopter view of this wonderful society that we live in, that in so many ways is now challenged, and about which in so many ways we are now worried, and we know that from the research. The great economic historian Neil Ferguson, spelt Niall but pronounced Neil, has recently observed that there are 3 great challenges confronting the West. And he said in ascending order they are radical Islamic terrorism. The next is the possibility, the serious possibility, even probability, of miscalculation between today's superpower and the rising superpower. And historically, that has often led to very serious breakdowns in understanding and therefore in peace. But he said the greatest threat of all, which if we could only overcome would mean that we could deal with those threats and many others around us, is that we no longer believe in our own culture. We no longer understand our own history, our own values, and our own freedoms, and because we don't understand them, we are adopting attitudes and practices which place them at risk. And he went on to say that social media is now creating such an unstable environment, and one which hands such power to people who hate and people who want to pull down and people who want to destroy, that governments may, in the West, in the end, be swamped. Those are very serious and challenging words. What does he mean? Our greatest danger is that we've lost our understanding of our own cultural roots. He's not alone. Winston Churchill in 1933 wrote that any culture which does not pass on to its children an understanding of their heritage, and he specifically said its religious beliefs and its heroes, is in effect saying that that history and that culture and that background is irrelevant and even harmful, and that leads young people without a sense of purpose or direction and meaning, and here are the chilling words, and thereby open to Karl Marx's dictum that a people who do not know their history are easily persuaded. And as I look around Western cultures today, including our own, I am amazed at how people are easily persuaded. They fall for the most ridiculous ideas. They adopt at a whim whole philosophies which have been tried infinitely many times down through history and have failed. And I want to say to you today, I love being an Australian. I've actually been incredibly clever in a couple of ways in my life. I chose my parents wisely, and I made sure that they were Australian. We are fortunate indeed, are we not? And we don't use the word freedom as much as the Americans do, but I'm beginning to think perhaps we should, because there is a very real battle going on now in our culture as to what freedom looks like. Do we base freedom around the idea that we ought to be free to do all things that we choose within a framework of responsibility and dictate to government how they will manage what they should do and no more? Or do we hand our freedoms over to government and allow them to tell us what we can say and what we can think and what we can do? This is playing out hugely in America at the moment. They're a country almost at war with itself. So let me make a few observations about freedom. The first thing to notice is that almost no people down through the ages, in any culture, in any society, and even today around the world, have known the sorts of freedoms that we take for granted. They are very, very rare, which suggests that we ought to understand where they come from and what they are, in order that we might best preserve them. Now, we tend to think of freedoms in the simple terms of it's freedom of speech, it's freedom of assembly, it's freedom to own property, and what have you. But actually, you know, the first freedom, and I think the genius of our harmonious society stems from this, is actually probably, or was probably, freedom of conscience. Our culture learnt around 450 to 500 years ago, after the Reformation. There was a very serious downside of the Reformation. Those in minority views were horribly persecuted, or those who held minority views. You had burnings at the stake. Can you think of anything more dreadful to do to a fellow human being? And after a while, it dawned on people that this was certainly, firstly, not very Christian. Secondly, that it was a pretty smelly and horrible business, and it was very cruel. And thirdly, it was just downright dumb, because today's minorities often end up being tomorrow's majority. And when they turn the tables, they often turn the sword as well. The idea emerged that it was much more civilised and acceptable to allow people to hold to their own views. And I say to you, I believe our most precious freedom is the right to believe and to think as we choose, and then to be able to manifest those things that we believe in and that we think are true. And that as part and parcel of that, we must respect one another despite our differences. In fact, I would say the neatest way to describe the loss of freedom that I think now confronts us as we think about where many elements of academia, frankly, even the media, those who argue for big government and an increasing role of the state in our lives are taking us. Freedom might be best defined in the negative. We are free when we are when we have the right to express a minority view without fear of sanction. Our forebears, it was burning at the stake. Then it was the guillotine or the hangman's noose. Today, you can be socially killed in social media, and increasingly governments are picking up that thread as well and starting to tell you what you can say. And what needs to be understood about that is that when they're telling you what you can say, they are beginning to tell you what you can think. It is a fundamental denial of what I believe is our first and most important freedom. I therefore want to say to you, as Australians who I trust all value freedom, that we need to rediscover the old adage. You've all heard it. I may disagree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. You've all heard that? It's often attributed to Voltaire, who, by the way, was not a very nice man. In many ways, not an admirable character and not somebody you'd want to model your life on. He didn't say it. It was his biographer as recently as the 1930s. It's a summation of his views, but it's a very important concept, isn't it? If I disagree vehemently with Gaelle that I'm going to defend to the death her right to say it, I'm saying two things that I think are fundamentally important to a society like ours if it's going to work properly. The first is, Gaelle, I may disagree with you, I'm sure we don't, if I do, but I respect you as a person. As that great Prime Minister Robert Menzies put it in one of his radio speeches one day, he said, the spirit of democracy, or democracy is not so much a machine as a spirit, I said this last night, in which we acknowledge that there are many different outcomes for many different people. We're not all the same, but we do acknowledge that under heaven every soul is of equal value. I have no right to lord it over you as a fellow Australian, even if I disagree with you. I must respect you. Isn't that the basis of a civilised discussion? Respect for one another. The second point that arises out of it is that if you're going to get good outcomes, you need the ideas on the table. I need to hear what you're saying. I need to test my own theories by allowing them to be exposed to your attack on them. And the issue is the idea on the table. It's not your feeling about me or mine about you. That's how a civil society should work. It was that slow dawning of that realisation that we needed to respect one another because we all have value that gave rise to the rule of law, to the idea of the vote, as one American put it. We're so good we have to give ourselves the vote, we're so bad we have to give ourselves the vote. It's all grounded in this idea of proper respect for one another. I believe that this is an unbelievably important concept, and I also believe that if we don't now start to push back and push back strongly against the new version of that creed, which to me seems to run along the lines of, if you dare disagree with me, I will accuse you of one of two heinous crimes. You are either guilty of hate speech or you are guilty of racism. They're the two words that get bandied around more than anything else. Or worse, you're guilty of both, and therefore it is my moral duty to fight you to the death to silence you. That seems to me to be where the modern trend lines are going. So what is freedom? Well, I say to you, it has to be seen as freedom from, if you like, fear, the thing we've just been talking about, for expressing a view, or fear for your physical safety. Personal freedom from addiction or enslavement to some problem of character failing or what have you. From being arrested in the middle of the night because you disagree with the government of the day. They're the negative freedoms, freedom from. We'd all agree they're important. But then there's freedom to be what you can be. That's the positive freedom. That's where, believe it or not, we get unstuck. Because we don't understand our history. Because we've turned the idea of positive freedom into the idea of license. Why do I mention this morning? I mention it because the data shows that trust has broken down unbelievably seriously in Australia, and it's closely tied to what we do with our freedoms. The research shows that confidence in our parliaments and in our politicians is at record levels, or at record-breaking bad levels. Lack of confidence. Our confidence in our institutions, including, of course, the banks, is now also being smashed. It's not too strong a word to use. What does that have to do with freedom? It's actually quite easy. Peter Costello was rightly recognised, and is recognised, as one of Australia's greatest treasurers. The first treasurer of the United States was a man called Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton made the observation that there are two ways to enslave a nation and to cost it its freedom. One is military takeover, the other is financial indebtedness. You lose your freedoms with financial indebtedness. But actually that's incomplete. When institutions and the people in them will not do what we expect of them, we become distrustful and we run for the rule book. What do I mean? We don't trust government, so what do we do federally? We jam them. We elect a government and then we jam it in the Senate. We won't let it govern because we don't trust governments. You see what I'm driving at? What are we going to do when we don't trust banks? We're going to demand that the politicians tie them up in more and more and more and more regulations because we feel they won't do what they ought to do, so we have to tie them up in law. You can see the same thing coming out of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into sexual abuse in the churches. Demands for more and more laws to bind us up and to bind other people up because they're not doing what they ought to do. So you see, we threaten freedom from within when we stop using positive freedom to do what we ought to do and to respect other people's freedoms and to treat our neighbour as ourselves and use our freedom in the form of licence to do whatever we like and thus start impacting on other people's freedom and breaking down trust. So I just make those observations this morning to you as a very passionate Australian. As I said at the outset, I count myself so fortunate to live in the incredible freedom that we enjoy in this country. But I have to tell you that I think it is seriously endangered by our lack of understanding of its roots, and of, if you like, its ultimate dependence in a democracy on us as citizens being good citizens, being trustworthy citizens, having a strong sense of civic responsibility. All the American forefathers, in that, it's amazing when you go looking at the history books, when they were setting up the great experiment in democracy in America, said it will only survive when the people do what they ought to do without having to be coerced. So we need to be people of character. We want character in our leaders. It's the essential ingredient for good politicians. I'm here supporting Gaelle, because, and I say this very sincerely, I don't do this very often now. You know, occasionally you get asked to go and campaign for people. I don't do it very often. But for people like Gaelle, it's a privilege to do it because it gives me an opportunity to say, you're worried about your country, you ought to be worried about your country. The surveys show that Australians are very concerned about their country. You need and you want leaders of character. When they offer themselves, get behind them. It's one of the most powerful things you can do to help preserve the freedoms that we all want to see our children and our grandchildren enjoy. Gaelle, thank you very much for having me. Happy to take some questions.